I decided to record this video for the benefit of people who put a lot of trust and belief in science and in what science tells us, and organisations who we should be able to hold as being, very ethical and very non-judgmental, non-biased in their findings. And last year, a study came out, mortality resulting from undesirable behaviours in dogs aged under 3 years attending primary care veterinary practices in England. And it was a study that was conducted on behalf of the Royal School of Veterinary Studies at the University of Edinburgh. And what the study basically found was that the highest reason for mortality, for death in dogs under 3 years old, was undesirable behaviours, which is an interesting study. I did a Facebook post on this a while back, closer to the time, but it was quite a lengthy post, and I should imagine a lot of people couldn't be bothered to read it. Which is absolutely understandable. But I just wanted to show for the people who put their faith in organisations and certain titles, letters that come after names and things like this, where academic, prowess, people who trust in that. And this study here, when it came out, one of the people who ran the study was a Dr. Dan O'Neill. And I remember reading at the time on Yahoo News that Dr. Dan O'Neill was quoted as saying, "Some owners use severe beatings and electric shock collars if their pets misbehave, meaning the animals are at risk of compromised welfare." So there were a few things that came out on that quote when I read it, or a few feelings that were stirred and questions that I wanted to ask. So I contacted Dr. O'Neill and I put the questions to him, and I'll quickly tell you what these questions were. And I said, I noticed in the Associated Press today that you were quoted as having said that some owners use severe beatings and electric shock collars if their pets misbehave, meaning that the animals are at risk of compromised welfare. I then asked, given the influence of the Royal College, I would respectfully ask the following questions in relation to this quote. Are we saying that the administration of a minor static pulse capable of being felt by a dog at energy levels below that of human perception is to be considered equal to severe beatings? Or indeed that the administration of 1 to 2 seconds of behaviour-linked, high-level startle in order to promote or preserve life and freedom is akin to severe beatings? That was the first question I asked. The second one, is this conclusion reached as a result of comprehensive, accessible evidence of compromised welfare through the professional use of electronic training aids obtained via the behaviour study? So is it as a result of what happened in the study, showing that professional use of remote collars, compromised welfare resulted in undesirable behaviours linked to severe beatings? I also asked what specific scientific measurements were used to compare and equate low-level electronic pulse with owner-inflicted severe beatings. So if you're going to put the two in the same paragraph, what studies were done, what scientific measures did you undertake in order to draw conclusions that say the two belong side by side, because it obviously implies that they're one and the same in the way that it's presented. I said, were severe beatings observed for accuracy and comparison throughout the study? Did anybody actually see a severe beating take place? What measures are used by members of the veterinary profession to directly attribute life-compromising behaviour problems necessitating destruction of the animal with the use of electronic training aids by the owner or another third party at some juncture prior to destruction? What are the typical behavioural characteristics, and what environmental filtration system is used to negate any other aspect of the dog's heritage, exposure, health or training as being responsible in part or in whole for the behaviour presented? So what I'm basically asking there is, how are you determining that any animal presented with an undesirable behaviour that is deemed fit for destruction, how are you determining that that behaviour is either in part or in whole attributable to the use of an electronic training collar rather than anything else that dog, including its genetic predisposition, its exposure, its life experiences, the way it's been handled, trained, consequences to actions that it's experienced throughout its life? What filtration system do you employ in order to say that the use of an electronic training system, a training collar, is that which has resulted in the undesirable behaviour presented before you? I also asked, what proportion of the owners who used electric shock collars had undertaken prior training beforehand, and what proportion of that training was reward-based only. So are we saying that people simply go out, put an electronic collar on their dog, and their dog now has an undesirable behaviour? Or has the person conducted reward-based training beforehand and then decided to use an electronic training collar? And if that is the case, how are you able to differentiate between which, unless you've seen the dog before, during and after its entire lifetime, how are you able to differentiate and to pinpoint which aspect of that dog's experiences, be it the reward training or the electronic collar, is responsible for the undesirable behaviour presented before you? What proportion of those dogs presented for destruction subsequently had their problematic behaviour successfully modified through reward-based only procedures? So how many of these dogs that were about to be euthanised were suddenly turned around and not euthanised through modern, science-based, reward-based training procedures? I asked what efforts were undertaken throughout the study period to observe and assess dogs undergoing training or behaviour modification procedures, involving the application of electronic training aids outside of scientific studies governed by ethical license. So how many people have you actually spoken to using electronic training aids that aren't limited to the parameters of a scientific study, which are limited by ethical permissions? How many people have you actually gone out and sat down and observed and worked with to be able to draw the conclusions that you're drawing? And I said, where dogs have failed to respond to popularised reward-based training efforts, does the Royal College condone euthanasia as the next logical step? For example, does the Royal College consider momentary discomfort, startle or both, contingent upon welfare compromising behaviour, to be greater risk to welfare than inaction, permanent restrictions upon species-specific behaviours or destruction? So is it worse to cause a dog a moment of discomfort, a moment of startle, than to give it a lifetime of restraint and restriction or death? Does the Royal College have evidence of livestock killing dogs which, having undertaken reward-based modification efforts, subsequently proved themselves safe in the presence of livestock but the absence of the owner or handler? I asked this final question since, due to ethical permissions, the DEFRA-funded Lincoln study failed to test for efficacy in this critical component of modification, rendering the results valueless in terms of applied effect. So basically what I've asked is, okay, if we're saying that if we're lumping together electric shock collars and severe beatings, then what was undertaken to establish that these two belong together and that either one of those things, should they have occurred, how do you know they occurred, and what were they witnessed occurring, and how are you coming to the conclusion that they are the principal reasons for the destruction, for the undesirable behaviours occurring in the dogs? Kindly, Dr. O'Neill did reply to me, and he said, where are we? Thank you for your detailed reply. He was kind enough to forward the study on to me. I asked if we could meet so that we could discuss it. Sadly, I'd be unable to meet specifically, as I hardly have any time to sleep these days, but maybe we'd bump into each other at some time in the future. So he wasn't prepared to meet and discuss. Reading through the study, here is the issue that I have with it. And as I say, there it is. 2018, looking at the principal reasons for the euthanasia of dogs under 3 years old and undesirable behaviour being the primary one. And I read through this, I've read through it, and I've gone through the references looking for the evidence to support the use or the statement that electronic training collars, or shock collars as it likes to call them, are responsible or are a primary factor. Now, when I come to just before the conclusion, at the very end of the study, I get animal welfare implications is the heading. Animals that exhibit undesirable behaviours, UBs, are at risk of compromised welfare, either because of their own underlying emotional motivations for the behaviour, for example anxiety or fear, or because of the ways which their owners might seek to resolve the problem, e.g. the use of aversive techniques such as electric shock collars. Schindler and van der Borg, 2004. Is the only cited study to support the inclusion of that statement, right? Just goes on to say the high level of reporting behaviours, blah, 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 blah. Nothing to do with remote training collars there. Goes on about core competency skills for veterinary graduates, etc. So of every possible thing that could be responsible for an undesirable behaviour, what's thrown in there is that owners may seek the use of aversive techniques such as electric shock collars. I believe 5% or less than 5% of the UK population, pet owning population, dog owning population, has used an electronic training collar at some point. 5%. That leaves 95% who haven't. Yet an electronic training collar, dubbed electric shock collar, makes an impact in a highly respectable scientific study as being a potential cause for the undesirable behaviours that occur. Now that in itself is strange. The Schilder and Van der Borg study, if you look at that for those who are familiar with it, looked at German Shepherd guard dog training in the Netherlands in 2004 by people who, even according to the researchers themselves, were fairly abusive, fairly harsh. I think fairly harsh is the words in the way that they treated the dogs, just in general. So these were guys that were training dogs for a specific purpose, and it was a very utilitarian mindset from reading the study on the dogs. And it bears no relation whatsoever. They were using levels on collars that were unrecorded, doesn't say why or how or, for what duration, or there's no indication in that study as to how those electronic training collars were used. So you've basically got potentially total misuse of a tool in an environment that bears no correlation whatsoever to the pet owning public in the United Kingdom, being cited as the only supporting reference for the inclusion of the use of electronic training collars as being responsible for the rise or the prevalence of undesirable behaviours in pet dogs in the UK. Now, this is terrible, right? Because you're just thinking, well, where has this come from? And I'll go down through the conclusion and I'm looking for more, and there isn't anything. There isn't anything. So I get down to the acknowledgements. And this is the bit that I put on a Facebook post last year. We're grateful to the Kennel Club Charitable Trust and Dogs Trust for supporting Vet Compass. Dan O'Neill was supported at the Royal College, the RVC, Royal Veterinary College, by an award from the Kennel Club Charitable Trust. So the people funding this study are the very people who are pushing for a total ban on electronic training aids in the UK. And the only aversive technique, the aversive tool, the only blameworthy tool that's put into this study is an electric training collar, even though it isn't referred to by any owner throughout the study. Nowhere does it come up that an electronic training collar is responsible, yet it slides in at the end and it's cited by Dr. O'Neill along with severe beatings as being a potential cause or at fault, blameworthy for this rise in undesirable behaviours. There's science for you, folks. That is the value of science when it's bought and paid for.